All right, everyone, welcome. I am incredibly excited to introduce our seminar today, which is a series of lightning talks by ESPM faculty that span a whole wide array of disciplinary expertise, and the talks will all be focused on sustainable futures in light of the array of global change pressures that require complex and innovative solutions. So we have 6 speakers lined up today. As I said, all of whom are ESPM faculty, and we'll have back-to-back talks and save questions for the last 20 minutes or so. So I'm going to let us kind of dive right in and introduce our first speaker, Professor Schell, who is an urban ecologist here in the department.
All right, thanks, Miranda, and thank y'all for having me. I'm gonna be quick, so now we can set a good example. We like to, in the lab, really emphasize this point that systemic oppression is a conservation issue. In fact, I would make the argument, and so will many of others in this room, that you can't see it any other way because of the fact that social and economic injustices oftentimes impede conservation progress. And a lot of the work that we do are in these urban systems that are laden with historical and contemporary inequities, everything from systemic biases influencing structural racism and classism that influence where the impervious surfaces are, which influences where urban heat islands are, which is also influenced by environmental cooling that's provided by the trees and vegetation therein, which, as it should be noted, the urban systems are designed, right? They are designed in a way that really demarcates and chops and screws 6 ways to Sunday, the way in which cities are formed and how wildlife responds therein. So we've been doing quite a bit of work, really, from biodiversity to behavior. For instance, here, what you see is a camera trap grid or multiple camera trap transects that we use to understand how wildlife respond to different social and ecological pressures, working with a bunch of organizations that you see up here. But certainly it does stand to reason when we start talking about biodiversity and economic injustices and white supremacy and racial capitalism, all those things float over people's heads, especially for those that are a little reticent to start that conversation around how wildlife and racism are connected. So one of the ways that we help them is by guiding them, showing them videos like this, right? Connecting people back to the animals that we live with, the spaces that we live in. One of the flagship species that we study in the lab are coyotes. Why? Well, because they're hyperpolarizing. You either love them or you hate them. And these 2 videos from San Francisco demonstrate behaviors not only of the animals themselves. For instance, this animal in Golden Gate Park that is stalking a child, or this animal right here who is being hand-fed by a person in SF. It also is showing the behavior of the people as well. These people are trying to make a connection with wildlife, albeit not in the most appropriate way, but we really drill down not only at the abstract, but the fine scale level too, to help folks understand that these behaviors, the behaviors of ghosts, us being those ghosts, are driving these factors. So to that point, recently we put together and had a book published on the very topic around urban biodiversity and equity. It just came out earlier this year that really encapsulates and sells this framework around biodiversity conservation in, of, for, and with cities, thinking about how we co-produce these practices and strategies with each other, because we are all trying to seek more interconnectedness in the community, and we can do that through our non-human kin as well as ourselves. How am I doing? Is that good? I'm done.
Next up, I would like to introduce Adrienne Correa, who will be presenting on leveraging trophic transmission to support coral dominance and reef resilience.
Hi, everyone. So my lab's research seeks to understand how microbial contributions influence reef health, and also to try to leverage these microbes to enhance reef resilience to stress. So coral reefs are valuable, they're productive, they're biodiverse, and human communities really need reefs in addition to the 25% of no marine species that live on them. But unfortunately, at this point, without significant human intervention, we're looking at a scenario where we're going to lose the functioning of most reefs as we know them within 25 years. And that's through things like coral bleaching, which is caused by warming seas due to climate change, resulting in a massive loss of beneficial microbes from corals. And that's what you can see here with these white skeletons. They've lost the pigment of the microbes that coral animals typically contain, and this can cause corals to die. So there are a whole bunch of microbial groups that are typically found in corals. And then within each of these groups, there's lots of diversity, many lineages. And all of these microbes are really important to the health of the coral colony in terms of providing them with nutrition, influencing their growth rates, influencing their thermal tolerance, their ability to resist pathogens, etc. So the race is on among scientists around the world to basically try to come up with beneficial microbial cocktails or probiotics that we might be able to provide to corals in certain scenarios to bolster their survival and performance. And we're making, good progress in this, in identifying these microbial groups. But at the same time, there are serious challenges in terms of the scalability of this probiotic dosing, as well as other factors. But, reefs span hundreds of kilometers, and so getting these probiotics to corals is a real challenge. And so my lab, one of the things that we're thinking about is how trophic interactions or trophic transmission of these beneficial microbes might be useful in this scalability issue. So, here's a very simple food web. Corals and algae live on the reef bottom and they compete with each other for space. And usually when we think about the consumers eating these resources on the reef bottom, we're thinking about grazing fish, helping maintain coral dominance by physically removing algal competitors. And when we think about what coral-eating fishes do, we usually think about them breaking up little pieces of coral colonies and making space for other species to live. But we don't typically think about them as helping maintain coral dominance on reefs. But at the same time, when all of these fishes are eating their resource species, they swim around the reef and then they're potentially defecating out a whole bunch of the microbes that live inside of the corals and the algae. And so this could be a silver lining of getting eaten for corals if these consumers are spraying around the beneficial microbes that corals need to survive. So it could help neighboring corals acquire their microbes, or it could help these coral colonies deal with changing environmental conditions by switching the symbionts that they have. So our lab started looking into this, and we found that actually, in fact, the feces of coral-eating fishes are amazing environmental hotspots for these beneficial coral microbes, much more than you find in the sand or the water column. And so we started digging into this, and we saw not only are there like 100 million of these cells in the feces of what some fish distribute within a small area of reef per day, but that these cells are definitely alive, these microbial cells. And we're in the proof of concept stage for showing that yes, corals that receive or interact with these species can take up and establish those microbes as symbionts. So there is potential for leveraging this consumptive interaction to sort of reinforce or provide probiotics across reefs to bolster reef health, and maybe even to kind of recondition areas that have lost a lot of their corals to have a microbial environment that's more conducive to restoring corals. And so, a user-inspired future thing that I would like to look into as a lab is whether or not we could get drones that potentially act like fish in certain ways and at certain times in order to achieve this scalability of probiotic dosing. So there are various ways, there's various ways in which you might want a drone rather than an actual reef fish that I can talk about during the question period. But it might help us, if drones are just biting off little bits of corals, then we don't have to worry about identifying and making probiotic cocktails sometimes. And certainly there are some aspects in which a drone can be rechargeable just from being in a marine environment that would solve some of the scalability and environmental endurance issues. So that's one of the ways that we are looking towards a sustainable future on reefs. So thanks.
All right, next up, we have Dr. Ted Grantham, who will be talking about collaboratory.
Yeah, I don't know, I actually have some advanced slide issue.
Who's a
It's
fresh
okay. We'll make it work. We'll make it work. Yeah. Everyone, thank you for coming today. Thanks, Miranda, for organizing this really cool session, and to Kelly for making it all work. So instead of highlighting some of the work that I'm doing in my lab and in collaboration with our freshwater science collaborators, Albert Rue and Stephanie Carlson, I wanted to focus on one particular project that was just funded. So I don't have any publications or results to share, but I hope to just share some of the excitement around this really cool project that was funded through University of California's Climate Action Initiative, which is a new program that the state funded to support research that advanced the state's climate action priorities. So water is the medium through which the most immediate and profound effects of climate change are going to be experienced. But many of the challenges that we face in California around water are not really the direct consequence of climate change, but rather the legacy of institutions and infrastructure that weren't really designed to meet the demands of present day society, especially demands for equity, environmental health, and sustainability, which is the theme we're touching on today. So my research really focuses on the unique challenges of adapting California's institutions, regulations, operations, infrastructure to these 21st century realities. And this isn't easy because the state has one of the most complex water management systems in the world. It's really difficult to track the way the water moves through the system, flows through the Sacramento-San Joaquin watersheds out to the Bay, and exported to the Bay Area and Southern California along the way. This is a quote that's really resonated with me as I sort of thinking about this project. So much water is moved around California by so many different agencies that maybe only the movers themselves know on any given day whose water is where. Joan Didion wrote that in 1979, and it's absolutely true today, unfortunately. There's really a lack of information about our water system and understanding of how water moves around that we're trying to address with this project. So really the overarching goal of this project, which we call Co-Equal, is to democratize water information in California and water decision-making in California through the development of new planning and visualization tools. So this project called Co-Equal, the Collaboratory for Equity in Water Applications, focuses on the development of participatory scenario-based modeling. And so this approach, I'm sorry about the slide advances, basically is focused on facilitated engagement with community partners by which alternative water futures are explored through these scenario visioning processes. Those get translated into water management models and a series of linked ecosystem models to understand outcomes of different scenarios. And these scenarios include both changes in water operations as well as changes in climate. And we hope that sort of through our exploration of these alternative decisions and scenarios, we can really broaden perspectives and illuminate new pathways, perhaps, for managing the system in ways that are more equitable and more sustainable. We have a lot of partners on this work. The core academic partners are shown here in the middle, and then we're also partnering with agencies, water utilities, and community members. These are the partners that were involved in the proposal development, and we've sort of expanded this group recently. So, what are we trying to achieve? We aim to deliver basically a data dashboard that will allow users to explore alternative water futures and assess how specific decisions may affect their access to water. Sorry about that. And we really hope our work in this area will inform novel adaptation solutions to the problems that we're grappling with in the state. I think probably the most important aspect or outcome of this work, and one that I'm most excited about, will be the new networks that we form across agencies and academic institutions and with NGOs, tribes, et cetera. And we really hope that these new networks will enhance participation in water decision making, which is currently lacking, and really foster new coalitions that will drive the policy reforms that we need to build more resilience, equity, and sustainability in California. So this is our website that we just launched. I'm excited to share if you want to learn more about the project. Thanks.
Thank you. So next, we will be hearing from Dr. Mills-Novoa, who is a human environment geographer here. Perfect.
Thanks everyone for being here. So I'm Meg and my lab is called the Climate Futures Lab. So we have future in the name, just saying. But CFL, which is also the Canadian Football League, is fundamentally focused on how we respond to climate change. Because how we respond to climate change will define our future. And the kind of future, it's an opportunity by which we cement injustices, or it could be an opportunity for emancipation and liberation for many of those who are most marginalized. So that's really a fundamental question and motivating sort of idea within CFL. In general, when I think about myself, the postdoc students that I support, we're really thinking about kind of 2 through lines through all of that work. First is really thinking about the impacts of climate change responses, both mitigation, so reducing greenhouse gases, as well as adaptation, or how we respond to climate change impacts, and how those responses will in turn affect equity. Second, there's a normative commitment to advancing justice through our work. That's about how we do our research. Those are the types of questions we ask. Those are the types of ways that we share out what we're doing in the lab. There's a number of projects here, and these are just sort of projects that I'm thinking about on a semi-regular basis, but I just am gonna quickly talk about this first after adaptation, and then I wanna actually talk about a new project for most of this time. So the first question is really about what happens after adaptation, climate change adaptation projects end. Right now, we are investing millions of dollars, if not billions on the international scale, in helping communities and ecosystems respond to the impacts of climate change, but most of those investments are 5 to 6 years, and then they're over. And very little is known about that afterlife. And so a big part of this project is really thinking through, in the context of climate change, which is an escalating, unfolding, ongoing crisis, how do we start to think about the ways that we think through adaptation? And we do it differently. And so this project is really tracing the afterlife of adaptation through planning processes, through experts, through people who were directly on the front lines, through ecosystems, to really understand how can we learn from the uncertain afterlives of these projects in order to better inform the way that we do adaptation. So this is a project I'm currently writing a book on, so I'm happy to talk more about it. But again, I want to focus on this new project for whatever time remains. So this new project is really based in the Great Basin, which is Eastern California, Nevada, Western Utah. And it's really thinking about the intersection of 3 sort of main issues and crises. One is climate and climate change, one is the biodiversity crisis, and one is environmental justice. And within the Great Basin, which is the most water scarce region in the United States, water is really at the crux of this. It's really the thing by which is sort of being fought over in the context of these intersecting crises. And the Great Basin is really sort of interesting hotspot for many reasons when we think about the green transition. First of all, it has huge swaths of public land. It's over Nevada alone is over 80% public land, so it makes it very sensitive to federal mandates around things like decarbonization or others things. There's also over 22 Native nations in Nevada alone, and many unresolved disputes over indigenous rights, territorial rights, water rights. And there's also a pattern of us thinking of the Great Basin as this great wasteland, this terra nullius, that, for us in California, we can develop lots of green renewable energy there to power our net zero obligations here in California, without really thinking about the communities that really rely on these landscapes. And so this project is one that we've been developing. I've been developing with a collaborator, Sophia Borges, over the last 1.5 years. And really what we're trying to understand is what are the frontiers of the green transition? So the green transition, including here utility scale solar, critical mineral mining, geothermal, as well as pump storage. So these are all these different kind of green technologies that are being implemented at really massive speed and scale across the Great Basin. And so we've been working with a number of stakeholders in the region to really think about where are the key places to start asking questions about the trade-offs that are going on between environmental justice concerns and the green transition. So we helped coordinate the Great Basin Water Justice Summit in 2022, where we started asking these questions. We have an advisory board of indigenous organizations, ranching organizations, and environmental organizations. This summer, we did our first scoping research where we visited a lot of these hotspots. And then we've gone back to the Great Basin Water Justice Summit this last fall, where we basically kind of outlined the project as we see it and got feedback on it. So this has been a participatory project that we've been working on and are now in the throes of just writing lots of funding proposals. And so in terms of what we're proposing to do one is to really create an interactive regional map. I think one need within the Great Transition is often we think project by project, but a lot of stakeholders that are on the ground are saying, hey, we're experiencing massive, sets of projects that are being thrown at us all at the same time, and we have very limited capacity. And so one of the things we're doing in this project is creating an interactive online map that would collate data that's quite hard to gather around geothermal pump storage, critical mineral mines, and then also overlaying that over critical water layers such as over-allocated and overdrafted basins, existing water conflicts, and then also connecting that to the human stories that are embedded in that landscape. So as part of that, we're also doing a number of case studies where we're working in particular places where we're seeing really important intersections between, concerns by local communities over, a vast set of projects, or concerns around speculation, or concerns about a whole number of different kind of water conflict dynamics. And so we're using these case studies to both do interviews and site visits. We're doing document review. We're also doing an analysis of water rights to understand where water is moving from and to, because all of the green transition projects that we're looking at in this new project have an impact on water resources in one way or another. We're also doing visioning workshops with these communities to talk about how they envision their future. And in particular, what are the types of climate futures that they see? It isn't about necessarily stopping these projects, but also thinking about what does benefit sharing look like in the context of the green transition. All of that will be embedded in a map. And that's it, thanks.
Thank you. All right, next up we have Dr. Dan Sanchez, who will be talking about innovative wood and biomass products in California.
Great. Thank you all for coming. It's really fun to see what everyone's doing in the department. I'm going to talk to you today about some of my research. My research takes things that grows and makes products out of them. And in this case, we're talking specifically about the most plentiful thing that grows, which is lignocellulosic biomass. This is something that is a really important management and engineering question for the state of California. So I want to start by talking about some of the, fires that we're experiencing here in California. And I think, the state has very recently become familiar with the concept of catastrophic wildfire. We have, the confluence of poorly managed forests along with kind of increasing fire weather and increasing disturbances on our landscapes. This is leading to millions of acres of California forests that are going up in wildfire. We've had quite a bit of, we've had actually a pretty nice reprieve for the past 2 years, given how moist it's been. But this is something that we really project is becoming worse, and in many parts of the Sierra Nevadas might actually lead to kind of wholesale ecosystem reversion out of forests. And so my research really focuses on what we can make out of California forest and woody biomass and the forest products that come from them, and how they help align or don't climate change mitigation and climate change adaptation goals that we have for the state. So we not only have this need, of course, to reduce the risk of catastrophic wildfire as a safety issue. We also have it is a climate mitigation issue as well. There are increasing calls for us to use our natural and working lands here in California to store more carbon or to create lower carbon products. And I think about all of those, really crossing both energy products as well as building materials and structural wood products. So this is why I'm really interested in this hypothesis in particular. And that is that really, if we want to reduce the density and improve the resilience of our forests that we have in California, we're likely going to need to do either what's known as mechanical vegetation thinning, which is what you think. It's using chainsaws and other mechanical equipment to cut down trees and to rearrange fuels within the forest. Or we can also use prescribed fire. When we use mechanical vegetation removal or thinning, the thin trees are burned and left to decay or burned in a pile burn. And it's really only large structural trees, particularly in California, quite big ones, quite wide ones, that we use to make different products. So I asked the question with some of my colleagues here in the forestry department, also some great folks in the energy and resources group. What would it mean if we had these markets for higher value wood products? What would that mean for wildfire risk within the state? What would that mean for the overall carbon impacts for the state of California? We did some really fun work. One of that involved thinking about where we could have wildfire hazard reduction. The areas that are the darkest on this map right here and the most red are the ones that are simultaneously where we're seeing the most reduction of wildfire hazard, as well as the areas that have kind of the highest priority landscape rank that the state of California has given it. And we see particularly this opportunity really in the kind of the west slope of the Sierra Nevadas to really dramatically reduce wildfire hazard reduction. In this case, we think that if we thin California's forests and manage them differently and scale up wood product markets for the next 40 years, we will see 12 million acres less of wildfire kind of across the state. And that includes 3 million acres of really the catastrophic standard replacing wildfire that we're experiencing within the state. We also find that it's a carbon benefit in order to do this when you consider the competing interactions of reducing the amount of carbon on our landscapes, but putting more biomass carbon into our economy. When you also consider things like the reduction in disturbance and wildfire and its impact on carbon stocks, we really find that this is a pretty exciting opportunity, not only to reduce wildfire risk, but to get good net carbon outcomes for the state of California and its economy. I'll pause there and look forward to the Q&A, but thank you for listening about some of the work that I do.
Thank you. And next up, we have Dr. Whendee Silver, who will be talking about the climate change mitigation potential of working lands. Thank you. Wow, what a great department we have, right? I just love being part of ESPM. So I'm going to talk about what our lab does. We're a biogeochemistry lab and an ecosystem ecology lab, and we do a variety of things, a lot of basic science, trying to understand things like greenhouse gas emissions. But we also are trying to figure out how to slow climate change. This is the Mills-Novoa graph that's probably iconic, you all know it. This is carbon dioxide concentrations that are increasing over time in the atmosphere. This is when ESPM started. And that's the increase since ESPM started as of the end of last month. So pretty striking, we have a big problem. Emissions reduction alone will no longer be sufficient to solve climate change. So we've all spent a lot of time thinking about how to get people out of their cars and how to get factories to clean up their emissions and how to slow tropical deforestation, but that is no longer sufficient to solve the problem. And I've illustrated that by taking the Mills-Novoa curve and just extending it out, assuming business as usual in the blue. And the black line is a hypothetical optimistic emissions reduction scenario. And you can see CO2 continues to go up. What we really need to do is bend the curve. That's the red line. We need to both reduce emissions and draw CO2 out of the atmosphere. It's very controversial. Some people are not comfortable with this. One way to do that is to use mechanical approaches that suck CO2 out. Another potential approach is natural and working lands. And natural and working lands, especially plants that are ecosystems that have plants, have a built-in mechanism to pull CO2 out of the atmosphere with plants. So that's what we have been investigating, the potential to do that. Does it work? How might it work? What are the pluses and minuses? So just to illustrate from one project that we're working on, we looked at some really, I would say, low-hanging fruit. And God, I never thought that I would be doing this when I kind of sold myself as a tropical ecologist. But we looked at some really high emitting sources in California. Dairy lagoons. These are manure lagoons. They emit huge amounts of methane, a very potent greenhouse gas. If we took the manure out of dairy lagoons and we put it into a composting system for storage instead of lagoons, we would reduce emissions by 5 million metric tons of CO2 annually. So we go from 7.5 to 2.5. So we'd save a lot, we'd reduce emissions. That's not negative emissions, that's emissions reduction. But then if we take that and we apply it to just 25% of California's rangelands, we increase plant growth, which pulls carbon out of the atmosphere and stores it in soils,
we've done that research, and we end up with just over a quarter of California's rangeland, a sequestration rate of 21 million metric tons of CO2 equivalent. So that's huge, right? That's negative emissions. Why would anybody want to do this? Well, they're already applying manure. So what we're doing is taking that manure and putting it through a composting system, which reduces a lot of problems, particularly with air quality and water pollution, and increases plant growth rate for farmers and ranchers. So this is something that has beneficial impacts. We're looking at other potential approaches as well. One is applying thin layers of rock dust or biochar alone and in combination with or without compost. Rock dust is another waste product that's getting a lot of press, getting very popular in the scientific community because it has the potential to sequester inorganic carbon through geophysical processes. And we were really interested in that because we didn't think it would work. But the other reason we were interested in it is because it has the potential, in theory, to reduce the emissions of two other greenhouse gases, nitrous oxide and methane. So we applied it to fields that had been manured, a very thin layer of rock dust. And what we found was, sure enough, nitrous oxide emissions were lower, and we have a hint that methane emissions might also be lower. Removing methane is a big benefit for the climate system if we can figure out how to do that. Okay, so what are we doing into the future? Well, one of the things that we learned from these previous studies was that if we could monitor and measure things continuously, we get so much more information on how ecosystems are structured and how they function. And that allows us to really target how to make these changes that can help slow climate change. So now we're working with engineers here at Berkeley and at other institutions to build low-cost sensors that are printed using inkjet printing and other printing techniques like silk screen printing that would be very, very accessible to farmers, to ranchers, to scientists, to policymakers, whoever wants them. We can make a stake with a whole suite of sensors for less than $10. You can read them on your cell phone. We have 2 sensors that are working really well now and have been published and are usable. When we increase our data acquisition, we can do a lot of things. First of all, that continuous measurement allows us to predict and model fluxes much, much better than we could do in the past. It also helps us with MRV, the measurement, reporting and verification component of climate change mitigation, which is something that I think a lot of policymakers and a lot of practitioners in this area are struggling with. So that's where we're going, and thank you for letting me share that.
Well, yeah, thank you to all of the speakers. That was such an amazing array of research that you're all tackling to solve it, to create sustainable futures. So, so thank you. And now I want to kind of open it up to questions for any of the speakers. Feel free to chime in, and those on Zoom, you can put the questions. I think, yeah, the best thing to do would be to just put your questions in the chat. And so maybe we can kind of bring the speakers up here. Anyone wanna, yeah.
I have a question for Dr. Sanchez. Well, thank you so much to all the speakers. Like, that was so incredible, inspiring to hear about the research presented. So, thank you. I think on your results slide, you had statistics reported or measurements reported for acres of hazard reduced, and then also acres of potential standard placing fire avoided. I was curious if you could talk about how it was like modeled or calculated.
Yeah, in this case, we were using a US Forest Service tool called the Fire and Fuels Extension. It's part of the forest vegetation simulator that we use to predict the growth and yield and the impact of different silvicultural practices on stands in California. And so in this case, we were assuming a certain, actually we were varying the severity of fire weather across all the different treatments that we were doing and seeing how that impacted the fire on the landscape. I think, one of the important things to note is that really, there are 5 categories of fire and fire intensity and the forest fuels extension. And it's really, it's the tail end fires. It's category 4 and category 5, these stand replacing fires that are really disturbing and unprecedented within the state. Yeah.
I have a question for Dr. Silver. On the side where you show the metric tons that were carbon that was moved from the atmosphere after applying the manure to the compost manure to the rangelands, do you have a timeline for when you start to see those effects? Were those immediate or were those a little bit longer?
That's a really good question. We see effects in the first year, in the first couple of years. It really depends on how much you add. Small amounts make it difficult to detect in the soil over short time periods. Smaller amounts, like some ranchers are adding about a 1/4 inch. About 3 years, we can really detect an effect. And then we've modeled that out into the future to see what we see. And we see that depending on where you are in the state, it peaks somewhere around 17 to 30 years, but that's from a single application. So, you know, people might want to apply within that. The other interesting piece of that is that in the past, we haven't had long-term studies to follow up on this. So this year, we're just recently funded to do a 15-year resurvey of sites that we started 15 years ago. So we'll remeasure those sites and see what we see. But the ranchers on those sites, we have gone back to those sites periodically, and they're still seeing increased growth on those sites, which was a big surprise and a big biogeochemical mystery in some ways. So it's interesting to follow up on that.
Thank you.
Ted, tell us about the data challenges in your, we talked about all the different agencies in California. So gathering all of these data, how do you do it? Is that part of your process? I mean, your program, this democratization, this is a very ill-formed question, but like, do you have to grab stuff from all the different agencies and pull them together?
Yeah, I mean, we're tackling, I think, one part of the water data challenge for California. So, and basically all of California's water data is in disarray. We're dealing with one aspect, which is basically the information and models that are used to inform how water is allocated across the state. So basically, California has this sort of integrated system of water management that comprises, you know, dozens of dams and canals. And all that water infrastructure that moves water around is represented by a model that are used by state and federal agencies called CalSim. And this model is very hard for the public to access and understand and work with. So that's where we're starting, is just trying to make this how decisions are made around water allocations and all the inputs and outputs that entails much more accessible. We're not really dealing with issues around water rights, which is a whole other issue. But so I think the piece of the data challenge that we're tackling is really questions around, you know, where does your water come from? How's your access to water going to be affected by climate change and different decisions? What are the outcomes for ecosystems for different types of water users across the state, and sort of how equitable are the solutions is sort of the piece of the puzzle that we're trying to tackle right now. And we're going to develop something, I think, that will be analogous to CalADAPT that you've been very involved in, but it will be really representing the dynamics around how decision making and planning is done in the state of water, not just the physical climate processes that influence where water is. Very cool.
I have a question for Chris. So Chris, I know that you're collecting just really a lot of wildlife data from cameras and other methods, I suppose. And I'm wondering how you take that data, like what, I can't think of the word, but the trophic levels or whatever, and the animal behavior data that you're acquiring, and use that in your larger framework of the socio-ecological system and equity.
Yeah, great question. So we oftentimes lean on a lot of foundational concepts in ecology, things like the ecological niche or source or sink habitats, right? Or predator-prey dynamics. And the data of where the animals are tell us a lot about how not only the ecological processes, but the social processes play a role in that and sort of disrupt that traditional narrative. So a good example may be, for instance, if we may think about source or sink habitats, and maybe source habitat would be a place that has a ton of green space, a lot of access to water and food resources, as well as minimal human activity. you could say that that type of habitat exists over here in the flats, right? Whether it be Point Pinole, or it be Malate Beach that's in Richmond, or it be McLaughlin Lee Shore. But all of those places are relatively depauperate in their carnivore kind of species richness. And that's in large part because the environmental contaminants that are over there are incredibly high. So the only other animals we've been able to detect are raccoons, ground squirrels, and possums. So we haven't even gotten deer that way, right? So just using an ecological lens alone doesn't tell us what we need to know about where the animals are and how they're using the space.
Thank you so much for your talk. I have a question moving on from Meg, and we really need to see some synergy between your project and both of your work involves a lot of multi-species engagement. And I can imagine that taking so much time and effort and a lot of resources. So if you could speak a little bit about what you learned from that process and what are some more challenges.
You can start, I'm just starting out where you.
Starting out. Thanks for the question, Adrienne. I think that one thing that I've really enjoyed about being in a faculty position versus being a PhD student is the ability to give things the time they need to build relationships. And so the fact that we're just now at the proposal writing stage after 1.5 years, I think speaks to these complexities of how long it takes to really build the relationships necessary to have those partnerships be meaningful and genuine. In terms of some of the challenges that have come forward on that, I think, we're studying water is a really contentious issue. And it's not like everybody at that table that we're partnered with agrees on what a water future should look like under climate change in the context of where they live, even if they live in the same place. So I think that there's challenges there about, as a researcher, thinking about how you negotiate those kind of multiple imaginaries that are at the table. And then I also think that there's just really logistical challenges. Right now, we're in the throes of getting tribal authorization with many of the tribes who are sort of overseeing the case study areas that we're working in. And that's just been, this has been a months-long process of going to tribal council meetings, explaining, writing protocols, negotiating protocols. And so, there's just sort of also the logistics of that take time, that often don't work on the normal gestation of like how long we have for, that NSF project to happen. And so that's why we're trying to get all these authorizations in place before we try to recruit more significant funding into the project. But those have been just some of the challenges. I will say this is my first project based in the US. I usually work in Latin America. And it has been, for me, it just is such a different, every place is so different. And so it's been really interesting to build these relationships. And I've really appreciated that I can go for a weekend and see people, or like they're actually, I think that that's been something that I've really enjoyed in the context of this project.
Yeah, I'll just add one thing that's been difficult about the project that we're embarking on is that, this was front and center in this grant program, this UC climate action program was, this idea of, doing research that's going to result in action and actually really center that work around the needs of, Spanish communities and underserved communities that have not been part of the decision-making, sort of at the table. The problem is that this is we have great resource to do this work, but it's a two-year project. And so, the state has put up, I think this is a tremendous investment into research against priorities, and they did center, kind of community engagement and participation was like a core tenet of how they evaluate the projects. But then they put us in this very difficult situation and talking about relationship building to try to deliver outcomes in 2 years, puts us in a very difficult spot. So we're gonna do our best, and we can hope if we demonstrate value, we can carry this forward for to have more lasting impact. But that's a really tricky part of this work in particular.
Thank you for the insightful lightning talks. I have a question for everybody. I work at the Associate Center for Business and Environment. One of the questions that we've been wrestling with is local versus global applications or impact. And it seems like a lot of the projects that we presented are focused on California. And so I'm curious what motivates you to focus on California. It's for University of California. And how do you engage with that motivation in light of that there might be environments that are more data poor, or more in need of research, or more in need of data as it is here?
I can start. We do a lot of work outside of California and a lot of work kind of on the global system.
But for this kind of solution-based science, for what we're doing, California is so far out in front of most other places. That one thing, there's funding. I mean, there's funding for the projects like these climate action projects. We just got a 5th assessment grant, the California climate assessment. I was part of the 4th assessment process. You know, it's wonderful funding to be able to work on these questions and to build a network of people and involve people who care, policymakers, ranchers, a whole range of stakeholders. People are just there and ready to go. So it makes it in some ways an easier place to do these kinds of things. But we do recognize that it needs to move out of California. And so there's a lot of discussion, at least in our group and amongst the partners that I work with, of how to have more of a national or international impact. Because some of the questions that we're working on, like climate change, is not a state level question.
Yeah, I mean, I'll add that a good chunk of us are doing this work in the state, one, because we want to avoid doing parachute science, right? We are not necessarily from many of those other places, whether domestically or internationally. So it feels disingenuous to go do science there and then come back here and present results on the PowerPoint slide that aren't going to go anywhere, right? Pair that with the fact that California's GDP is larger than most countries, right? And we have a ton of biodiversity hotspots right here. We don't need to go anywhere else. In many ways, we serve as a beacon for a lot of other places on how to actually do some of this work in a productive way that is both with the community as well as with other kind of organizations, and how we build those coalitions. So it's both local impact because we are locally here, this is where we're situated, and we do serve as like a global kind of guidebook or blueprint.
Maybe the last thing I'll add, go ahead, no, Adrienne. Yeah.
I'll add one more little piece that in addition to what Chris just said about parachute science, some of it working on shallow water tropical reefs, I don't have a choice. I don't have an option for that system to work in California. And that's something that is a struggle in terms of, you know, issues with parachute science. But another dimension of that is that there is also, you can ask certain types of questions and do some of your science better if you are closer to your study sites. There are certain things, you know, your science, there are ways in which I wish our science could progress faster, but I can't get in the car and go, or take a train or whatever and go, you know, try something quickly. I have to wait until the next field season. And so that's a lot of constrained time and pressure that way. So it's really kind of a blessing to be able to work locally.
Yeah, I'll just say I think it's actually built into kind of the culture of and the mandate of the College of Natural Resources that we work with resource managers and other stakeholders around the state of California on the environment issues we care about. So both Ted and I have an appointment that really makes that our job. It's called Professor of Cooperative Extension, but in fact, I think everyone in CNR has like a 10% appointment with the Ag Experiment Station, right? Which is really meant to kind of foster this kind of applied research and outreach and extension within the state.
I had a question about the drone. How do you, so the Symbion survived like the passage to the digestive tract, but what are the modifications that happen along the digestive tract within the coral fish? How do you plan on replicating that with the drone?
That is, thank you for asking about the drone. I actually was thinking about how I wish I had another slide of just like, why even a drone instead of just putting more fish back. So I think I just want to acknowledge that another option would be people are already kind of farming corals and growing them in nurseries and then putting those pieces back out on reefs. And we could start thinking about just trying to use husbandry to grow butterfly fish and release them out onto reefs as well. But there are some moments when it might not be as useful to have a fish as it would to have a drone. So for example, if we come up with better probiotic cocktails than what a particular fish species might create in a location, or if certain things have been lost in a location and we need a more synthetic cocktail, then the drone could help us release that. And then in terms of mimicking sort of what sorts of things happen to a microbial cell as it passes through a fish gut. We were actually just talking about that in lab today and thinking about using molecular tools to look for signatures of upregulation of certain kind of genetic pathways and things to see whether or not microbes tend to have sex more often and, you know, generate more mutations and diversity when they're in a gut environment, or if they tend to get exposed when they normally wouldn't and get infected with viruses, or what other things happen to their physiology. So there's all sorts of interesting space to go into there to understand, like, for a microbe, what does it mean to go through the gut of a consumer? And then we could think about simulating that in a drone. So there, you know, for one more piece about the drone, I think there are also certain times on reefs when, because you've lost a lot of corals, you've lost a lot of fishes, or if bleaching has happened, a lot of those microbes have left the corals that remain. And sometimes butterfly fish that remain will focus too much on the living corals. So there might be moments where, you know, you want to put something in particular in a drone, or maybe have the microbes be less stressed. Maybe you don't even want to mimic all the processes that might happen in a fish gut so that you can release healthier, better probiotics. So there's tons of questions, and that is definitely, you know, it's a fun space in a lightning talk to be like, okay, long-term secret aspiration fish drones. But if anybody knows, you know, if anybody does robotics or synthetic species, please let me know.
Right, and we're at the, I guess, midpoint of the hour. It's 4:30, and so I want to kind of thank the speakers again, and also we will be having a social at the Milford Courtyard. Everyone is welcome and encouraged to join. And so, yeah, thank you all again.